The porcelain teacups clinked against their saucers in the Memphis morning heat, steam rising from coffee that would never be finished. By 10:15 a.m. on August 12, 1857, 3 generations of the Thornfield family lay convulsing on their dining room floor, foam gathering at the corners of their mouths as Isabella Washington stood in the doorway, her 6-year-old daughter's hand clutched tight in her own. This is the story of how enslaved woman's final act of desperation became a legend whispered through safe houses from Tennessee to Canada, and how one breakfast changed the course of 2 lives forever. Isabella had risen before dawn that morning, just as she had every day for the past 15 years since Master Thornfield purchased her at the Memphis slave market. The kitchen still held the lingering scent of yesterday's bread, mixed with the acrid smell of wood ash from the cook stove, and the ever-present dampness that clung to everything in the river city. Her calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, grinding the morning coffee beans, her fingers working the mill handle in steady, hypnotic circles. But this morning was different. Hidden beneath the coffee grounds lay a powder so fine it might have been mistaken for flour if anyone had bothered to look closely. Isabella had been collecting pokeweed roots for months, drying them in secret, grinding them to powder in the dead of night while the great house slept. Every root represented a choice, every grinding session a step toward the unthinkable. The Thornfield plantation sat on a bend of the Mississippi River, where the morning mist rolled off the water like ghostly fingers reaching toward the white-columned mansion. Isabella had been purchased specifically to serve as a nursemaid. Her previous master had praised her gentle way with children, never mentioning that gentleness had been born from necessity, not nature. She had raised young Master Edmund, then Miss Caroline, and finally little Master James, watching them grow from helpless infants into miniature versions of their parents. Extract from Isabella's later testimony, recorded by Underground Railroad conductor Sarah Mitchell, 1859. I loved them, children, like they was my own blood. Fed them from my breast when their mama was too delicate. Walked the floors with them when they cried, but they wasn't mine to love, and I wasn't nothing but property to them. The morning routine played out as it always did. Isabella prepared the breakfast tray silver service, polished to mirror brightness, fine china painted with delicate roses, crystal glasses that caught the early light. She had performed this ritual thousands of times, each morning blending into the next in an endless cycle of servitude. Master Thornfield liked his coffee strong and black. Miss Caroline preferred hers, with cream and 2 spoonfuls of sugar. The children drank milk, fresh from the plantation's dairy cows. But 1857 had brought changes to the Thornfield household that would prove fatal. Cotton prices had fallen, and Master Thornfield spoke openly at dinner about the need to liquidate certain assets. Isabella understood the euphemism. She had seen the slave trader's wagon twice in the past month, had watched as families were separated, children torn from their mother's arms, while the white family continued their evening meal as if nothing had happened. Death is patient. The turning point had come 3 days earlier, when 6-year-old Amelia Isabella's daughter, born of a union that was never consensual but always expected, had been marked for sale. Master Thornfield's debts required immediate attention, and a healthy young girl would fetch good money in New Orleans. The transaction was scheduled for August 15th, just 3 days away. Isabella had begged on her knees in the master's study, her voice cracking as she offered herself in place of her daughter. She promised extra work, longer hours, anything to keep Amelia close. Master Thornfield had laughed a sound like ice cracking on the river and told her that her feelings were irrelevant. Property didn't negotiate with property. That night, Isabella had made her choice. She retrieved the hidden pouch of pokeweed powder from behind the loose brick in the kitchen fireplace, where she had been storing it for months. The deadly alkaloids would be tasteless in coffee, invisible in milk, undetectable until it was far too late. The family gathered for breakfast at 8:30 a.m., as they always did. Master Thornfield, 43 years old, and carrying the soft belly of a man who had never worked with his hands. Miss Caroline, his wife of 20 years, pale and delicate as the china she insisted on for every meal. Edmund, 19, and preparing for university, already showing his father's casual cruelty toward the enslaved population. Miss Caroline's daughter from her first marriage, 17-year-old Isabella, named with bitter irony for the woman who served her, and little James, just 8 years old, still young enough to smile at Isabella when his parents weren't watching. Isabella served the coffee with steady hands, her face revealing nothing. She had learned long ago to wear a mask of compliance, to hide her thoughts behind downcast eyes and respectful nods. But beneath that mask, her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched them lift their cups, as she waited for the inevitable. The poison worked faster than she had expected. Master Thornfield was the first to collapse, his coffee cup shattering against the hardwood floor. Then Miss Caroline, her delicate hands clawing at her throat. The children followed moments later, their young bodies unable to fight the alkaloids flooding their systems. How many people would have stayed to watch? How many would have felt mercy creeping in as they witnessed the convulsions, the desperate gasping for air? But Isabella had watched her daughter's birth father sell her siblings south, had seen children no older than Amelia worked to death in the cotton fields, had endured years of abuse that would never appear in any record book. She turned away from the dining room and walked calmly to the servants' quarters, where Amelia waited with the small bundle Isabella had prepared, in secret their only possessions, wrapped in a faded quilt. Mother and daughter slipped out through the kitchen garden as the great house fell silent behind them, their bare feet making no sound on the dew-wet grass. One choice, 5 deaths, 2 lives suddenly impossibly free. But freedom in 1857 Tennessee was an illusion for runaway slaves, especially those who had left bodies in their wake. The moment the Thornfield deaths were discovered, every law enforcement officer from Memphis to the Ohio River would be searching for Isabella Washington and her daughter. The Underground Railroad would be their only hope if they could reach it before the bloodhounds found their scent. As they walked toward the river in the pre-dawn darkness, Isabella wondered if she had saved her daughter or damned them both. The answer would depend on how far they could run, how well they could hide, and whether the network of abolitionists and freed slaves could move fast enough to stay ahead of the vengeance that was surely coming. What she couldn't know was that her desperate act of violence would echo through the Underground Railroad for years to come, becoming both cautionary tale and inspiration. The enslaved woman who poisoned an entire household would become a legend, but legends, Isabella would learn, cast shadows that are impossible to escape. Before we follow Isabella and Amelia into the darkness beyond Memphis, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with viewers around the world, and if this story has grabbed your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because Isabella's journey is just beginning. The Mississippi River churned brown and violent in the pre-dawn light, its surface broken by debris from the recent rains. Isabella pressed her back against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree, feeling the dampness seep through her thin cotton dress as she watched the torches moving through the streets of Memphis below. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with the river's muddy scent, and somewhere in the distance, the baying of bloodhounds cut through the morning air like a knife. The hunt for Isabella Washington had begun before the sun cleared the horizon, and every minute they remained near the city brought them closer to capture and the hangman's noose. The Thornfield family's bodies had been discovered at 9:47 a.m. when the cook, an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, arrived to clear the breakfast dishes. Her screams had brought the overseer running, and within an hour, every law enforcement officer in Shelby County knew they were searching for a murderer. The reward posted by Master Thornfield's brother was substantial $500 for Isabella, dead or alive, and $50 for information leading to her capture. Isabella clutched Amelia's hand as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, following the river north toward what she hoped would be sanctuary. The child had not spoken since they left the plantation, her dark eyes wide with fear and confusion. She was too young to understand why they were running, too young to grasp that the woman who had fed her breakfast every morning for 6 years now lay convulsing on a hardwood floor. Extract from Memphis Appeal, August 13, 1857. The heinous crime perpetrated upon the respectable Thornfield family has shocked our community to its very core. Citizens are warned that the murderess Isabella, described as a Negro woman of medium height with a scar upon her left hand, remains at large and should be considered extremely dangerous. The Underground Railroad in Memphis operated through a network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors, but reaching them required knowledge Isabella didn't possess. She knew only fragments, whispered conversations between field hands, coded spirituals sung in the slave quarters, rumors of a white woman who helped runaways cross the river. The reality of finding these mysterious allies while avoiding the growing manhunt seemed impossible. Trust becomes currency when survival depends on strangers. Isabella's first stroke of fortune came at dawn when she encountered Samuel Freeman, a freed blacksmith who recognized desperation when he saw it. Freeman operated a small forge near the river, and his position in the free black community made him a crucial link in the escape network. He took one look at Isabella and Amelia, two figures in worn clothing, moving with the hunted gait of runaways, and made his choice. "You can't travel by day," Freeman told them, as he led them to a hidden cellar beneath his workshop. The space was cramped, dark, smelling of coal dust and metal shavings, barely large enough for 2 people to lie flat. Patrol's been doubled since yesterday evening. Something's got them stirred up fierce. Freeman didn't ask what Isabella had done, and she didn't volunteer the information. In the Underground Railroad, questions were dangerous luxuries that could destroy lives. Better to move quickly, ask nothing, and trust that righteousness would sort itself out somewhere down the line. The cellar became their world for 3 days. Isabella and Amelia huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Freeman's daily work, above the ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the ordinary rhythms of a life lived in freedom. Occasionally, Freeman would bring them water and scraps of food, along with fragments of news from the outside world. The search was intensifying. Slave catchers had arrived from as far away as Nashville, drawn by the substantial reward. Dogs had been brought in from 3 counties, their handlers confident they could track Isabella's scent from the Thornfield plantation to wherever she had gone to ground. The Memphis newspapers were calling it the most extensive manhunt in Tennessee history. But Freeman brought other news as well, coded messages from conductors further north, confirmation that safe passage could be arranged if they could reach the next station. A Quaker family in Jackson, Tennessee, would shelter them for a night. From there, another conductor could guide them toward the Ohio River, and eventually to freedom in Canada. Salvation measured in miles, hope counted by houses. The plan was simple but terrifying. Freeman would hide them in a false bottom of his supply wagon, beneath a load of iron bars and farming tools. The journey to Jackson would take 2 days, traveling only at night, avoiding the main roads where patrols were thickest. One wrong turn, one suspicious lawman, one barking dog, and Isabella and Amelia would face a fate that made death seem merciful. On their final night in Memphis, as Freeman prepared his wagon for the journey, Isabella allowed herself to look back toward the city lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere in that maze of streets and shadows lay the Thornfield plantation, where 5 people had died because she could not bear to watch her daughter sold away like livestock. She felt no regret for the act itself, only for the necessity that had driven her to it. Freeman appeared beside her, his voice low and urgent. "Time to go. Dawn's coming faster than we'd like, and the roads won't stay empty much longer." Isabella lifted Amelia into her arms, feeling the child's weight settle against her chest. At 6 years old, Amelia was small for her age. A blessing now, as they would need to fit into a space designed for cargo, not human beings. Isabella whispered softly in her daughter's ear, the same lullaby she had sung when Amelia was a baby, trying to offer comfort in a situation that defied comfort. The false bottom of Freeman's wagon was a masterpiece of desperate engineering, a space just wide enough for two people to lie side by side, ventilated through tiny holes that looked like wood grain from the outside. Isabella and Amelia crawled into their hiding place as Freeman arranged the iron bars above them, creating a barrier between the fugitives and the world. As the wagon began to move, rocking gently over the rutted roads that led away from Memphis, Isabella closed her eyes and tried to imagine Canada a place she had never seen, but which existed in her mind as the opposite of everything she had known. No masters, no overseers, no fear of the auction block. A place where Amelia could grow up as something more than property. The irony was not lost on her that she was traveling north in a conveyance designed for iron, the same metal used to forge the chains that had bound her for 24 years. But sometimes, Isabella reflected, as the wagon wheels found their rhythm, the tools of oppression could be transformed into instruments of liberation. How would they react to discovery? What preparations had they made for the inevitable moment when hiding would no longer be enough? The questions haunted Isabella as the miles passed beneath them, each turn of the wheel carrying them further from the only life she had ever known and closer to whatever waited in the darkness ahead. The wagon wheel struck a pothole with enough force to rattle Isabella's teeth, sending a sharp pain through her shoulder where it pressed against the wooden planking. Above them, Freeman's iron bars clanged together like wind chimes in a storm, masking any sound she and Amelia might have made in their cramped hiding place. The air was thick with the smell of rust and sweat, each breath a struggle in the suffocating darkness that had become their world for the past 18 hours. Every jolt of the wagon brought them closer to Jackson and closer to the moment when their fragile disguise would either hold or shatter completely. Freeman had warned them that the most dangerous stretch lay ahead. Between Memphis and Jackson, the road passed through 3 county jurisdictions, each with its own sheriff, its own deputies, and its own eager slave catchers, hoping to claim the bounty on Isabella's head. The checkpoint at the Forked Deer River crossing was particularly treacherous. Every wagon was searched, every bill of sale examined, every suspicious traveler questioned at gunpoint. The first test came at dawn on August 15th, when Freeman's wagon approached a makeshift roadblock near Bolivar. Isabella could hear voices through the wooden planking, rough, aggressive tones that made her pull Amelia closer in the darkness. Her daughter had learned to remain perfectly still during these moments, understanding somehow that their lives depended on absolute silence. "Where are you headed with all that iron, boy?" The voice belonged to a white man accustomed to authority, someone who expected immediate compliance from any black person he encountered. Freeman's response was calm, respectful, exactly what the situation demanded. "Taking supplies to the widow Patterson's farm outside Jackson, sir. She's got fencing needs doing before winter sets in." Extract from Jackson Whig, August 16, 1857. Citizens are reminded to be vigilant in examining all Negro travelers, as the escaped murderess may attempt to disguise herself or seek aid from sympathetic persons. A reward of $600 now stands for information leading to capture. Isabella held her breath as Boots walked around the wagon, pausing directly above where she and Amelia lay hidden. The searcher was thorough, probing between the iron bars with what sounded like a rifle barrel, coming within inches of discovering their hiding place. One curious thrust in the wrong direction, one loose board, one frightened gasp from Amelia, and everything would end here on a dusty road in rural Tennessee. Discovery is always one breath away. But Freeman's engineering held. The false bottom remained invisible. The ventilation holes looked like natural wood grain, and after 10 minutes that felt like hours, The boots moved away. The wagon lurched forward, wheels finding their rhythm again as they continued north toward whatever waited at the next checkpoint. The psychological toll of hiding was harder than the physical discomfort. Isabella had spent 24 years of her life under constant surveillance, always aware that her movements, her expressions, even her thoughts were subject to inspection by those who owned her. But this was different. This was voluntary imprisonment, chosen confinement that somehow felt both liberating and terrifying. As the hours passed, Isabella found herself thinking about the Thornfield children she had raised. Young Master Edmund, who had learned cruelty at his father's knee, but who had once cried when Isabella accidentally stepped on a butterfly. Miss Caroline's daughter, who shared Isabella's name, and who had sometimes looked at her with something that might have been affection before learning that such feelings were inappropriate. And little James, barely 8 years old, who had died because Isabella could not bear to let them sell her daughter away. The weight of those deaths pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She had taken 5 lives to save 2, a calculation that made sense in the desperate mathematics of slavery, but which would haunt her for whatever remained of her days. There was no undoing what she had done, no prayer that could resurrect the dead, no amount of running that could outpace the memory of Master Thornfield's face as the poison took hold. The second checkpoint came near sunset, at a crossroads where 3 counties met. This time, the search was more perfunctory. The deputies were tired, eager to finish their shift and return to their suppers. Freeman played his role perfectly, the humble freedman transporting goods for his white employer, grateful for the work and anxious to complete his delivery before dark. But Isabella could hear something else in the voice's frustration, perhaps even doubt about the manhunt that had consumed so many resources with so little result. The reward money was substantial, but 2 days of searching had produced nothing but false leads and wasted effort. Some of the enthusiasm was beginning to fade. As darkness fell and they approached the outskirts of Jackson, Freeman finally spoke to his hidden passengers. "Almost there now. The widow Patterson's farm is just ahead. She's expecting us. But the dangerous part's coming next. Trust multiplied by desperation equals hope." The widow Patterson turned out to be a slight woman in her 50s, her gray hair pinned back severely, her pale eyes holding a determination that seemed to burn from within. She greeted Freeman with a nod and immediately set about examining the wagon, running her hands along the false bottom until she found the hidden latches. "2 passengers," Freeman said quietly. "Been traveling since Memphis. I know who they are." Patterson's voice carried the flat certainty of someone accustomed to dangerous secrets. "The whole network's been buzzing. Question is whether they're ready for what comes next." Isabella and Amelia emerged from their hiding place, like creatures returning to light after years underground. Isabella's legs buckled momentarily, as blood returned to cramped muscles, and Amelia clung to her mother's dress, overwhelmed by the sudden space and fresh air. Patterson studied them both with calculating eyes. "You've got perhaps 6 hours before the search reaches Jackson proper. After that, every road north will be watched, every safe house compromised. The choice is yours. We can try to move you tonight, or you can wait here and hope the heat dies down." Isabella looked at her daughter, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in the child's face. Amelia had not complained once during their ordeal, but she was reaching the limits of what a 6-year-old body could endure. Another night of cramped hiding, another day of bouncing along rutted roads, another series of terrifying checkpoints. It might break them both. But staying meant risk of another kind. Every hour they remained in Tennessee brought fresh dangers, new opportunities for discovery. The slave catchers were not giving up. If anything, the size of the reward guaranteed they would become more aggressive, more thorough in their searches. How does desperation calculate odds when every choice leads to a different form of death? Isabella stood in Patterson's farmyard, holding her daughter's hand, and tried to weigh possibilities that defied rational analysis. North meant immediate danger, but ultimate freedom. South meant certain capture and probable execution. Standing still meant slow strangulation by circumstances beyond her control. The decision, when it came, felt less like choice than inevitability. They would continue north that very night, trusting their lives to strangers and hoping that the Underground Railroad's reputation for successful passages was more than wishful thinking. October wind that swept down from the Kentucky hills. Isabella pressed her eye to a crack between the weathered boards, watching the road that stretched toward the Ohio River and freedom, while behind her, Amelia slept fitfully on a pile of moldy straw. They had been running for 6 weeks now, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the slave catchers who seemed to multiply like shadows in their wake. Tonight would either deliver them to the promised land or destroy them completely, and Isabella no longer possessed the luxury of hoping for the best. The journey from Jackson had transformed them both. Amelia had grown silent and hollow-eyed, the carefree child replaced by someone who understood that survival meant invisibility. Isabella herself had lost 20 pounds, her clothes hanging loose on a frame hardened by constant fear and irregular meals. But they were alive, and they were together, and that had to be enough. Extract from Paducah Herald, September 20th, 1857. The notorious Memphis murderess continues to elude capture despite the tireless efforts of law enforcement across 3 states. Citizens are reminded that harboring fugitive slaves is a federal crime punishable by imprisonment and substantial fines. The Underground Railroad conductor who had brought them this far was a freed slave named Moses Garrett, a man whose scarred hands told stories of 20 years in Mississippi cotton fields before he purchased his freedom and dedicated his life to helping others escape bondage. Garrett moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single mistake meant death not just for the fugitives he shepherded, but for the entire network of conductors and station masters who made their work possible. "River's running high from the autumn rains," Garrett whispered as he joined Isabella at her makeshift observation post. "That's good and bad. Good because it means the ferry crossings are limited fewer places for the catchers to watch. Bad because the currents are stronger, and if something goes wrong," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Isabella had seen the Ohio River from a distance 2 days earlier, a brown ribbon of water that might as well have been an ocean for all the safety it represented. Crossing it meant freedom for those who made it to the far shore. But the river had claimed its share of runaway slaves over the years, bodies swept away by currents too powerful to fight, dreams drowned in muddy water that cared nothing for human aspirations. Hope measured in yards of rushing water. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. A Quaker family named Morrison operated a mill on the Kentucky side of the river, using their legitimate business to mask their Underground Railroad activities. Tonight, during the new moon, when darkness would provide maximum cover, a small boat would cross from the Ohio shore to collect Isabella and Amelia. The crossing would take perhaps 20 minutes. If the weather held 20 minutes, that would either end their long nightmare or ensure they never saw another dawn. But complications had developed. Word had reached Garrett that slave catchers were concentrating their efforts along the river crossings, convinced that their quarry was attempting to reach Ohio. Rewards had been increased again, now totaling $800 for Isabella, a fortune that guaranteed every bounty hunter in Kentucky would be watching the water. More troubling still, rumors suggested that someone within the Underground Railroad network was feeding information to the authorities. 3 separate groups of fugitive slaves had been captured in the past month, all taken at moments when they should have been safest. The betrayer's identity remained unknown, but their effectiveness was undeniable, and tonight, Isabella and Amelia would discover whether their location had been compromised as well. As darkness deepened, Garrett made his final preparations. He checked his pistol, a weapon he carried but hoped never to use, and reviewed the signals that would indicate whether the crossing was safe or had been discovered by hostile forces. A single lantern in the mill window meant proceed as planned. 2 lanterns meant delay until the following night. No lights at all meant run, and keep running until pursuit was impossible. "Whatever happens," Garrett told Isabella as they prepared to leave the barn, "don't let them take you alive. They'll make an example of you, public hanging, maybe worse. Better to die free than live as their trophy." Isabella nodded, understanding the mathematics of their situation. She had already killed 5 people to prevent her daughter's sale into slavery. Taking 2 more lives, her own and Amelia's, to prevent capture was simply the next logical step in a sequence that had begun with poison in a Memphis breakfast room. Death becomes an option when living means surrender. They reached the riverbank at midnight, moving through underbrush so thick it seemed designed to conceal desperate travelers. The Ohio ran dark and fast before them, its surface broken by debris and foam that caught what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover. On the far shore, barely visible through the gloom, stood the Morrison mill, and either salvation or a trap that would end everything. Isabella held Amelia close as they waited for the signal, feeling her daughter's heart beating against her chest like a frightened bird. The child had asked no questions during their journey, accepting each hardship with a resignation that broke Isabella's heart. 6 years old, and already she understood that the world was divided between those who owned and those who were owned, with no safe middle ground for people like them. The lantern appeared in the mill window at 12:17 a.m., a single flame that meant their boat was coming. Isabella felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the first hint of relief she had experienced in months. They would cross tonight. They would reach Ohio, and from there, the final stretch to Canada, where British law would protect them from American slave catchers. But as they waited for the boat to reach their shore, Isabella heard something that made her blood turn cold, the distant baying of hounds, growing closer with each passing minute. The dogs had found their trail, and behind the dogs would come men with guns and chains, and no mercy for a woman who had poisoned an entire white family. The boat was still 5 minutes from shore when the first torches appeared through the trees. Isabella faced the choice that every fugitive slave dreaded: surrender to capture, fight against impossible odds, or trust their lives to the dark water that had already claimed so many others. What would desperation choose when cornered between fire and flood? Isabella lifted Amelia in her arms and began walking toward the river, each step taking them closer to freedom or death, but away from the certainty of what waited behind them in the Tennessee darkness. The Ohio River's current grabbed at Isabella's ankles like skeletal fingers, the water shockingly cold even through her worn boots. Behind them, the torch flames grew brighter between the trees, accompanied by shouts and the increasingly frantic barking of tracking dogs who had finally found their quarry after weeks of false trails and dead ends. Ahead, barely visible in the moonless night, the Morrison family's rescue boat fought against the swollen current, its occupants rowing desperately toward shore. Isabella had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether to trust her daughter's life to strangers in a boat or face certain capture by men who would make her death a public spectacle. Moses Garrett splashed into the water beside her, his pistol drawn but pointed toward the ground. "They're too close," he whispered urgently. "Boat won't reach us before the catchers break through that tree line. We got to swim for it." The impossibility of the situation struck Isabella like a physical blow. Amelia could barely swim in calm water, let alone navigate the Ohio River's autumn flood stage. But surrender meant watching her daughter sold south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. The mathematics of desperation allowed for only one choice: hold tight to Mama, Isabella whispered in Amelia's ear as she waded deeper into the current. "Don't let go, no matter what happens." Extract from Cincinnati Enquirer, October 4th, 1857. Reports from Kentucky indicate that the escaped Memphis murderess attempted to flee across the Ohio River near Maysville. Pursued by a joint force of federal marshals and local militia, Witnesses report seeing figures in the water, but no bodies have been recovered. The first rifle shot cracked across the water just as Isabella lost her footing, the current immediately sweeping both mother and daughter downstream. She fought to keep Amelia's head above the surface, while the river tried to tear them apart with indifferent force. The child's grip on her mother's neck was so tight, it nearly choked Isabella. But she welcomed the pain. It meant Amelia was still conscious, still fighting. More shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the Kentucky shoreline like deadly fireflies. But the slave catchers were firing blind into darkness, hoping to hit targets they could barely see. The river itself provided better protection than any fortress wall, its rushing water swallowing bullets and making accurate aim impossible. Chaos becomes sanctuary when desperation needs cover. The rescue boat had abandoned its approach to the original landing spot, instead angling downstream to intercept Isabella and Amelia, as the current carried them toward a bend in the river where overhanging willows created deeper shadows. Isabella caught glimpses of the boat's occupants. 2 men rowing with mechanical precision, a woman in dark clothing calling out directions that were lost in the wind and water. "Here!" Isabella tried to shout, but river water filled her mouth, turning her cry into a choking gasp. Her waterlogged dress was dragging her down, threatening to pull both her and Amelia beneath the surface. She managed to grab hold of a piece of driftwood, part of a fence post perhaps, torn loose by the recent rains, and used it to keep them afloat as the current swept them further from their pursuers. The boat reached them just as Isabella's strength began to fail. Strong hands grabbed Amelia first, lifting the child from the water with practiced efficiency, then hauled Isabella herself over the gunwale with barely seconds to spare. She collapsed into the bottom of the boat, retching river water and shaking uncontrollably as the boat's occupants resumed rowing toward the Ohio shore. Samuel Morrison, the man at the bow, introduced himself quietly. "This is my son David and my wife Martha. You're safe now, or as safe as anyone can be on this water." Isabella tried to respond, but her teeth were chattering too violently for coherent speech. Martha Morrison wrapped both Isabella and Amelia in heavy blankets that smelled of wool and wood smoke, the first genuine warmth they had felt in weeks. Through the fog of exhaustion and relief, Isabella realized that they had actually done it, crossed the invisible line that separated slavery from freedom, bondage from possibility. Freedom measured in yards of muddy water, but the danger was far from over. Federal law still claimed authority over fugitive slaves, even on free soil, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it profitable for Ohio residents to capture and return runaways to their masters. The Morrison family's mill served as a way station, not a destination Isabella and Amelia would need to continue north to Canada before they could truly consider themselves safe. "Dogs can't track across water," David Morrison said as they approached the Ohio shore, "but they'll be watching every road out of Maysville by morning. We'll need to move you tonight if you're strong enough." Isabella nodded, though every muscle in her body screamed for rest. 6 weeks of running had taught her that safety was an illusion that could be shattered by a single mistake, a moment's carelessness, or simple bad luck. The network of conductors and safe houses that comprised the Underground Railroad was remarkably effective, but it was not infallible, and the stakes were too high to assume that survival was guaranteed. The Morrison Mill sat on the Ohio riverbank like something from a children's storybook white clapboard siding, a water wheel that turned steadily in the current, windows glowing with lamplight that suggested domestic tranquility. But Isabella had learned not to trust appearances. The most innocent-looking places could hide the greatest dangers, just as the most dangerous journeys sometimes led to unexpected sanctuary. Martha Morrison led them to a hidden room beneath the mill's main floor, accessed through a trapdoor concealed under sacks of grain. The space was larger than their previous hiding places, tall enough to stand in, wide enough for several people to sleep comfortably, but Isabella felt the familiar claustrophobia of confinement settling over her like a burial shroud. Tomorrow night, Samuel Morrison explained as he showed them the room's amenities, we'll move you to the next station, a farm outside Columbus. From there, you'll go to Toledo, then across Lake Erie to Windsor. 3 more stages, and you'll be under British protection. 3 more opportunities for capture, Isabella thought, but did not say. 3 more chances for betrayal, for accidents, for the simple bad luck that had dogged fugitive slaves since the first person decided that freedom was worth dying for. How many others had hidden in this room, hearts pounding with the same mixture of hope and terror that now consumed Isabella's thoughts? How many had made it to Canada? And how many had been dragged back to face the consequences of their desperate bid for liberty? The questions would have to wait. Exhaustion was finally claiming its due, and Isabella felt consciousness slipping away as she held Amelia close in the darkness beneath the mill floor. Above them, the water wheel continued its steady turning, marking time in a rhythm that spoke of permanence, of continuity, of a world where some things endured beyond the reach of human cruelty. The barn outside Windsor, Ontario, smelled of fresh hay and Canadian freedom, a scent Isabella had been dreaming of for 3 months, but never quite believed she would experience. Through gaps in the weathered boards, she could see Lake Erie stretching toward the horizon, its gray waters marking the final boundary between her past as property and her future as a human being. Beside her, Amelia slept peacefully for the first time since Memphis, no longer starting awake at every sound, every creak of wood that might signal discovery and capture. They had crossed into British territory just after dawn on November 2, 1857, carried by a fishing boat that reeked of perch and pike, but smelled like salvation to 2 exhausted fugitives who had traveled over 600 miles to reach this moment. The journey from Ohio had passed like a fever dream. 3 weeks of hidden compartments, midnight transfers, and conductors whose names Isabella never learned, but whose courage had delivered her to this impossible destination. The final crossing of Lake Erie had been the most terrifying yet, accomplished in a small boat during a November storm that threatened to accomplish what slave catchers and bloodhounds had failed to do. Extract from Windsor Herald, November 7th, 1857. Our community continues to welcome American refugees seeking liberty under British protection. The recent arrivals from the southern states find employment in our mills and farms, contributing to the prosperity of our growing settlement. Martha Freeman, the Quaker woman who operated this final safe house, possessed the calm certainty of someone who had shepherded hundreds of fugitives from bondage to freedom. She had examined Isabella and Amelia with experienced eyes, noting the physical toll of their journey while beginning the practical work of transformation from fugitives to citizens. "The hardest part's behind you now," Freeman said, as she provided them with clean clothes and hot soup. "But the adjustment ahead has its own challenges. Freedom's a skill that has to be learned, same as reading or arithmetic. Liberty requires education in its own possibilities." Isabella struggled to comprehend the reality of their situation. For 24 years, every moment of her life had been subject to someone else's authority: when to wake, what to eat, where to go, how to speak. The absence of that constant oversight felt both exhilarating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff and discovering that falling could feel like flying. The practical challenges were immediate and daunting. Isabella possessed no legal identity, no documented skills beyond those related to domestic servitude, no connections in a community where survival depended on finding work and establishing relationships. The Underground Railroad could deliver people to freedom, but it could not instantly provide the tools necessary to build a life worthy of the risks they had taken to achieve it. Freeman had connections throughout the Windsor refugee community, former slaves who had established businesses, churches, and mutual aid societies designed to help newcomers navigate the transition from bondage to citizenship. Isabella would find work, Freeman assured her, probably as a domestic servant initially, but with opportunities to learn reading and arithmetic that had been forbidden in Tennessee. "Your daughter will attend school," Freeman explained, watching Amelia explore the barn with the cautious curiosity of a child learning to trust her environment again. Real school, with books and teachers and other children who won't judge her by the color of her skin. She'll grow up Canadian, with all the possibilities that implies. The concept was almost too large for Isabella's imagination to contain. Amelia, free to learn, to dream, to become something more than property valued by the pound. The child who had witnessed her mother poison 5 people and then spent months hiding in wagon bottoms and basement rooms would have the chance to discover what life looked like when survival was not the only consideration. Children carry their parents' choices into futures their parents cannot see. But freedom came with its own form of haunting. Every night since leaving Memphis, Isabella had dreamed of the Thornfield family's final breakfast, the steam rising from their coffee cups, the casual conversation interrupted by convulsions, the look of betrayed confusion in young James's eyes as the poison took hold. She had saved her daughter, but the cost in human life would follow them both forever. The guilt was particularly acute when she considered the Underground Railroad conductors who had risked everything to help them escape. Samuel Freeman, Moses Garrett, the Morrison family, Martha Freeman, all of them had committed federal crimes to aid a woman who had murdered 5 people, including 3 children. Their courage made her crime possible, but it also made their sacrifice complicit in violence that could never be undone. During their second night in Windsor, Isabella finally asked the question that had been troubling her since Memphis. Do you think God can forgive what I did, taking those lives to save 2? Martha Freeman was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in contemplation. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar questions many times before. I've seen mothers throw their babies into rivers rather than watch them sold away, Freeman said quietly. I've seen men kill overseers with their bare hands when pushed beyond endurance. Slavery creates situations where there are no good choices, only degrees of tragedy. Your guilt proves you're still human, but don't let it consume what you fought so hard to achieve. Redemption begins with survival, but it doesn't end there. The refugee community in Windsor was larger than Isabella had expected. Nearly 300 former slaves who had made the journey north, each carrying their own stories of escape and transformation. Some had been free for years, establishing businesses and raising children who spoke English with Canadian accents. Others had arrived recently, still wearing the hollow-eyed expression of people adjusting to the absence of constant fear. Isabella found work within a week, employed by a Canadian merchant family who needed help with housekeeping and childcare. The irony was not lost on her. She had escaped slavery only to return to domestic service, albeit under radically different circumstances. But the distinction mattered. She received wages for her labor, lived in her own room rather than slave quarters, and could leave if the arrangement proved unsatisfactory. Most importantly, Amelia began attending the refugee school established by local abolitionists. Isabella watched her daughter learn to read, seeing the child's eyes widen with each new word mastered, each story absorbed. The girl who had huddled in hiding places for months was discovering that knowledge could be accumulated without permission, that curiosity was no longer a dangerous luxury. How does a person measure the weight of 5 deaths against a child's first day of school? Isabella stood outside the schoolhouse that November morning, watching Amelia disappear into a world of possibilities that slavery had never allowed her to imagine, and tried to calculate whether the price had been justified. The answer, she realized, would have to be worked out over the course of whatever life remained, to them both a life that would be lived in freedom, but which would forever carry the shadows of what that freedom had cost. The church bell in Windsor's refugee district chimed 8 times, marking another Sunday morning in Isabella's new life as a free woman. 5 years had passed since that terrible breakfast in Memphis, and the woman who had once served poison with the morning coffee now served communion bread to former slaves who gathered weekly to celebrate their survival. The scars on her hands had faded, but the weight of what she had done to secure their freedom remained as heavy as ever. Amelia, now 11 years old and fluent in both English and French, had grown into the kind of child Isabella could never have imagined during their desperate flight north. Confident, curious, unafraid to ask questions or express opinions that would have been unthinkable in the slave quarters of Tennessee. But even in freedom, the past refused to remain buried. Word had reached Windsor that the Memphis authorities had never officially closed the Thornfield case, and bounty hunters still occasionally appeared in border towns, following rumors of the woman who had poisoned an entire white family and vanished into the Underground Railroad. The reward had grown to $1,000, a fortune that guaranteed Isabella Washington would never be completely safe, even under British protection. Extract from Detroit Free Press, March 15, 1862. Sources report renewed interest in the Memphis murderess case. As Confederate authorities seek to apprehend fugitive slaves who committed violent crimes before the current conflict, readers are reminded that federal law still considers such persons to be escaped property, regardless of their current location. The outbreak of the Civil War had paradoxically made Isabella's situation both safer and more dangerous. Union victory would mean legal emancipation for all enslaved people, potentially removing her fugitive status entirely. But Confederate agents were actively working in Canada, attempting to recapture valuable slaves and return them south to support the war effort. A woman with Isabella's notoriety represented both a significant bounty and a powerful symbol of slave rebellion that needed to be crushed. War redefines the meaning of justice for those who escaped it. Martha Freeman had aged considerably in the 5 years since Isabella's arrival. Her hair now completely white, her movements slower, but her determination unchanged. She continued operating the safe house, though the flow of refugees had decreased as the Underground Railroad focused its efforts on supporting the Union cause. Freeman had become something of a mother figure to Isabella, offering guidance on matters both practical and spiritual. "You've paid your debt," Freeman told Isabella during one of their evening conversations. 5 deaths weighed against hundreds of lives saved by your example. Other mothers have found the courage to protect their children because they heard whispers of what you did in Memphis. The truth was more complex than Freeman's reassurance suggested. Isabella had indeed become a legend among enslaved people throughout the South, the woman who chose violence over submission, who proved that even the most powerless could strike back against their oppressors. But legends, Isabella had learned, were easier to create than to live with. Stories of her escape had spread through slave communities like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions claimed she had poisoned dozens of white families before fleeing north. Others suggested she possessed supernatural powers that allowed her to evade capture. The real Isabella Washington, living quietly in Windsor and struggling with guilt and nightmares, bore little resemblance to the avenging angel of folklore. Truth becomes myth when hope needs heroes more than facts. The psychological toll of her actions had never fully healed. Isabella still woke most nights from dreams filled with the faces of the Thornfield children, still flinched when she served food to others, still carried the knowledge that her freedom had been purchased with the lives of people who had never personally wronged her. Young James Thornfield had been barely 8 years old when the poison took him the same age Amelia had been when they reached Canada. But guilt existed alongside a fierce pride in what she had accomplished. Amelia was learning Latin and mathematics, skills that would have been not just forbidden, but physically dangerous for a slave child to possess. The girl spoke of becoming a teacher herself someday, of helping other refugee children adapt to their new lives in freedom. The future that Isabella's violence had made possible was already justifying itself in ways she could never have anticipated. The refugee community in Windsor had grown to nearly 800 people by 1862, creating a parallel society where former slaves could experiment with democracy, capitalism, and self-determination. Isabella served on the church board, helped organize the school system, and advised newly arrived fugitives on the practical challenges of building lives in freedom. The woman who had once been property now owned property herself, a small house where she and Amelia lived independently. Freedom multiplies when shared rather than hoarded. But the war's progression brought new anxieties. Confederate agents had been arrested in Toronto, carrying lists of high-value fugitive slaves whose recapture would serve both financial and propaganda purposes. Isabella's name appeared on every list, often accompanied by detailed physical descriptions and notes about her known associates. The safety of British territory was real, but not absolute. Kidnapping remained a constant threat. The solution, when it came, arrived in the form of a letter from an unexpected source. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist editor, had learned of Isabella's story through Underground Railroad contacts and wanted to feature her experiences in his newspaper. Not as Isabella Washington, the fugitive slave, but as a symbol of resistance whose story could inspire others to support the Union cause. "Your silence protects you," Garrison wrote, "but your voice could save thousands. The choice is yours, but history is watching." Isabella read the letter 3 times before showing it to Amelia, who was now old enough to understand the implications of their mother's past becoming public knowledge. The girl's response surprised her. "We can't hide forever," Amelia said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that freedom had taught her. "And maybe other children need to know that their mothers love them enough to fight." Courage inherited becomes courage multiplied. The decision to go public would transform Isabella from a fugitive into an icon, but it would also make her a permanent target for those who viewed slave rebellion as a crime that could never be forgiven. Standing in her Canadian kitchen, holding Garrison's letter, Isabella faced the same type of impossible choice that had driven her to poison the Thornfield family's breakfast 5 years earlier. How does a mother weigh her child's safety against the possibility of inspiring other mothers to protect their own children? How does someone who has killed for freedom decide whether to risk that freedom by speaking truth to power? The answer, Isabella realized, lay not in the past she was trying to escape, but in the future. She was trying to create a future where no mother would face the choice between watching her child sold away or committing murder to prevent it. That evening, she sat down to write her response to William Lloyd Garrison, beginning with words that would soon echo through abolitionist circles across 2 nations. "My name is Isabella Washington, and I have a story that needs telling." The Civil War would end slavery, but Isabella's legend had already begun to grow beyond anything the authorities could contain. Even today, historians debate whether she ever existed or was simply a composite of multiple resistance stories that merged into myth. But in the refugee communities of Ontario, and in the whispered conversations of enslaved people throughout the American South, the name Isabella Washington continued to represent something more powerful than historical fact: the possibility that even the powerless could choose violence over submission, could risk everything for freedom, and could win. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.